Okay, welcome everybody to our Hebrew College webinar entitled Jewish Spirituality, Inducting American Jews into New Modes of Religious Feeling. Delighted to welcome so many of you this afternoon, and we are going to have a real treat this afternoon with our visiting assistant professor in Jewish education, Ariel Levitas. Ariel has joined us this semester as a member of our adjunct faculty, and she will be teaching a number of courses for Hebrew College, both online and on campus. She resides in Philadelphia, and she is currently completing her doctorate at NYU in this field of emotion, religious feeling, and Jewish spirituality. So we're very privileged to get the cutting-edge research in this topic. We have people in our webinar who are joining us from all over the country, and we are delighted that you are with us. Some people are current students, some people are prospective students, and I see that some people are friends and neighbors of us, and we're delighted to have you all. For those of you who are interested in our doctoral program, we're going to have one slide about that at the very end, and we're delighted to tell you a little bit about how you can increase your learning and develop the kind of learning that we'll have this afternoon with Ariel. I will respond to Ariel for a few moments after she has presented in order to get the discussion going, and then we're very much inviting you to participate in questions and comments that you might have, particularly in relation to your own work, because we want to hear about the site-specific reactions and responses you have. Along with the people on the webinar, we also have people on site here at Hebrew College, and we'll be delighted to include them as well. We won't take names at this point because I don't want to spend extra time doing that, but pretty much people can see who's around and who's on the webinar today. When you are going to speak, do remember to unmute yourself and then mute back. It does reduce the amount of interference that comes through the different microphones. So to introduce Ariel this afternoon, I just want to say that Ariel, as I said, is a completing doctoral student at NYU in the field of religious feeling and Jewish spirituality. She has also done a lot of research development work with various agencies over a period of time, and has worked with some of the great sociologists and researchers of our time, Steve Cohen and others, and we are delighted to include her. She also has a background in congregational leadership and day school teaching, and therefore, Ariel, it's a real pleasure to have you address us this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Ariel Levitas. As Michael said, I'm a visiting assistant professor of Jewish education in the Shulman Graduate School this semester. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you to Hebrew College, Michael, Deb, and Amy for organizing this webinar. I'm going to be speaking today about work that developed out of my doctoral dissertation, and we want this to be an interactive presentation and to leave time for questions at the end. So I'm going to jump into the heart of my argument. But very briefly, methodologically, I just want to say that this is based on an ethnographic study of 3 sites engaged in Jewish spiritual education with American Jewish adults in their leisure time, and I'm happy to answer questions about method, site selection, etc., in the question and answer period at the end. So today I'll be speaking about emotional repertoires for Jewish spirituality. Okay, I'm going to claim something about the centrality of emotion in sites that teach Jewish spirituality, and a collective effort to induct Jewish adults into new modes of religious feeling. I'm going to argue that at the core of the contemporary Jewish engagement with spirituality is a communal project to remake the emotional capacities of Jews. And I just want to say very clearly at the outset that I'm not arguing in any way that spirituality can be reduced to emotion, but rather I want to acknowledge that emotions take center stage in sites that teach Jewish spirituality. And I contend that uncovering how emotions are understood, invoked, and harnessed in sites that teach Jewish spirituality is very revealing of evolving notions of Jewishness in the 21st century. So, hang on, I'm trying to switch sides. There we go. Beautiful. So, Jewish education is not static. And in every time and place, there are several coexisting theories for how Jewish education can and should work on the self. So one prevalent model is what Jonathan Wucher calls the inoculation model, and I have some features of this on the left side of this slide. And just broadly speaking, the premise of the inoculation model is that the primary purpose of Jewish education is to prevent assimilation, or what Jonathan Wucher calls assimilationitis. So within this model, Jewish education is an intervention for a pediatric population. Okay, it's for kids. It's short and painful, like a shot, and this sort of lines up with a lot of ideas about Hebrew school education in the latter part of the last century in America. Now, sites that teach Jewish spirituality are working with a different framework, and some features of this model are on the right side of this slide, which hopefully everyone can see. So today I'm going to focus my remarks on this last box here, highlighted in pink, and we're going to think together about sites that teach for Jewish spirituality and how they work on the affective self, or the emotional body. That's going the wrong way. There we go. Excellent. So in my research, I found that sites that teach Jewish spirituality put emotion at the center. Okay, again, not reducible to emotion, but rather emotion plays a key role in how teachers and learners of spirituality understand their work. Now, emotion is an important element of any identity, but instructions for emotion can be made more or less explicit in different settings. In Jewish spiritual settings, feelings take center stage. Emotions are often noted and discussed, and they're seen as part of the central work taking place in these sites. So I'm not saying there's more emotion in Jewish spiritual settings than in other Jewish settings, because all sites, Jewish in other words, have their emotional repertoires, but rather that emotion is often made explicit in the activities of groups that teach for Jewish spirituality. And classically, religious emotion has really been at the center of a lot of theories of religion, and I'm thinking of theorists like Durkheim or Schleiermacher or Otto. But there have been very few studies of Judaism and religious emotion. And in part, that's because of perceptions of Judaism as a gesetzes religion, that is a religion of law. So Jewish spirituality is an intervention to remake this idea of Judaism as all intellect and no feeling by putting the heart at the center of Jewish identity and practice. So I have here, this is a quote from Carly. She is a teacher in a Musar program that I observed, the Institute for Jewish Ethics, and Carly explained it like this. Quote, religion is much more an act of my head and the spiritual is more an act of my heart. As Jews, we often see ourselves as people of the law, but I would prefer that we see ourselves as people of the heart. Jewish spirituality takes the laws and brings them in our heart. So American Jews engaged in spiritual study and practice are confronted again and again with this foundational question. Can Jews be spiritual? And I hear this all the time when I speak about Jews and spirituality, or I hear people say, well, you know, spirituality isn't part of Judaism. Spirituality is like outside of Judaism. And there's been a strong suspicion in the American Jewish community that spirituality lies outside the bounds of normative Jewish identity. Okay, so where does this idea come from? Jews have long been seen as the antithesis of spirituality. Okay, this dates back to very early Christian polemics against Jews. They identified Jews as carnal Israel, while Christians were spiritual Israel. And Jews were seen as embodying materiality and a slavish literalism in terms of how they read classical canonical texts. And I argue that popular negative stereotypes of Jews in the U.S. in the 20th century can be understood as emotional deficits, okay, a failure of correct feeling, which reveals Jews' profound spiritual deficits. So at the heart of the Jewish question, which is the debate in the West about the place of Jews in modern civilization, is a question of the nature of Jews and their fundamental emotional capacity. So I want to say something about emotional repertoires, which is a theoretical undergirding of my work. So I found that a primary activity in sites that teach Jewish spirituality is the induction of participants into new emotional repertoires. So what do I mean by an emotional repertoire? An emotional repertoire is a received set of scripts for the proper performance of emotion. So sometimes an emotional response can feel automatic, okay? And it's true, the acting out of an emotional script could be both conscious or unconscious. Somebody tells me a sad story, and I might feel myself spontaneously and seemingly naturally begin to cry, or I might say to myself, oh, this is sad. I better show that I find this sad and cry, right? So an emotional actor, which is just a fancy way of saying a person in life, right? A person in life can have a sense of themselves as offering a spontaneous reaction or a strategically deployed response to a situation, right? How they use emotion. And an emotional repertoire is just basically a constellation of all these emotional scripts that were fed in our own particular culture that are available for us to reenact in a particular situation, okay? So, and within a culture, there can be different emotional scripts as well. The emotional scripts for women in our culture are different, for example, than the emotional scripts for men. And one can enact a script that is idealized and sanctioned, like happiness. Americans think it's very good to be happy as much as you possibly can, and people who are happy in America are generally looked upon very favorably, and that's not necessarily true in all places, right? And we also think it's bad to be unhappy, and so people who are unhappy are often assigned pathological dimensions, right? So there's a moral valence given to particular emotions. So what I found is that in sites that teach for Jewish spirituality, unsanctioned emotions, right, deviant emotions are often understood as distinctively Jewish. And being Jewish is seen as being the inheritor of a shared emotional repertoire that's very challenging to overcome and deeply at odds with spiritual emotion. Okay, so what do I mean by spiritual emotion here? So the emotional repertoire for spirituality generally emphasizes mild, positive emotion like peace, calm, gratitude. Okay, these are mild, positive affective behaviors, right? And what was interesting is I love, to use Google Images, and when I put all those emotions in, peace, calm, gratitude, I got the same image, and I don't know if that's just my search engine, but my search history, but I keep getting this image, right, of the lone meditator, sort of peacefully reflecting on a natural environment. Okay, so I think that this image probably does a pretty good job of capturing the emotional repertoire for spirituality. But what about the emotional repertoire for Judaism? Okay, so Judaism, in contrast, and this is Judaism as a religion, not Jews. Judaism is seen as having the wrong affect, and in this case, Judaism is seen as being under-emotional. So Judaism as a religion is associated with the rational, the decorous, the boring, and this is an image that was taken from Tablet magazine a couple years ago. Shows some people, they're in a pew in Shul, and like two of them are dozing off. So these are associations with Judaism as a religion. And here I have a quote from Anne. She was a participant in a Jewish meditation group that I observed. And she put it like this, quote, "Many synagogues, the services are so rote. I went to a bat mitzvah recently. It was horrible. I mean, just so dull and boring. I mean, I thought it was horrible. And like, how can anybody sit through this? Jewish mindful living is something different. I think the aliveness comes from the singing, the focus on joy and gratitude," right? So she's contrasting, right, the boring elements of Judaism with the more lively, positive elements of spirituality, Jewish spirituality. And then we have the problem of Jews. So whereas Judaism as a religion, right, has the wrong affective valence, it's under-emotional, Jews as a people have the wrong affective valence. They are over-emotional. And you can buy this hat online. It says high anxiety, right? So Jews have too much of the wrong kind of emotion. They're anxious, they're excitable, they are so materialistic that they're quite greedy, right? So Ross is always sort of giving us a portrait of this kind of American Jew. And Sherry, who was a participant in the Musar group, put it like this. She's talking about Jews and anxiety. She said, Jewish mothers don't sleep, they just worry with their eyes shut. So if we compare the emotional repertoires, right, we see that we have a problem. So in the center of this slide, you see the emotions associated with spirituality. And I took this from a commonly used psychology of religion questionnaire. Okay, so the items in the questionnaire, wherever they refer to emotion, I just pulled those words out. So we have words like deep inner peace, love, joy, thankful, selfless, right? So these kinds of feelings, that's the emotional repertoire of spirituality. And on our left, we have words associated with emotional repertoires of Judaism as a religion. So legalistic, intellectual, rote action, boring, dull, under-emotional. And on the right, we have words associated with the emotional repertoire for Jewishness. Jews, Jewish families, they're over-emotional, they're anxious, they're hysterical, they're overexcited, they're selfish, they're greedy. And you can see that there's a mismatch here. So the work of Jewish spirituality then is to bring American Jewry and their emotional selves into alignment with spirituality by remaking the emotional capacity of American Jews. And I think one thing that's really important to know about these sites is that whereas a lot of polemics against the Jews will give an account of Jews as essentially incapable of spiritual emotion, essentially emotionally deviant, sites that teach for Jewish spirituality believe that the essence of Jews and Judaism are sort of right in alignment with those spiritual capacities, right in that sort of wheelhouse of deep inner peace, love, joy, thankfulness, etc. But because of generations of trauma, okay, from oppression, pogroms, the Holocaust, forced migration, ruptures in family, and rupture in the chain between teacher and student, our capacity to have these spiritual feelings has been lost as a result of all this trauma. So the work of Jewish spirituality is the work of healing the American Jewish people and bringing them back in line with their true emotional capacities and nature. So that's a little bit about what I learned in my dissertation, and I've tried to keep this sort of short and sweet because I'm very interested in fielding some questions and getting some feedback and keeping the presentation as interactive as possible. So Michael, I'm going to turn it to you maybe for a few remarks. I'm going to minimize my PowerPoint screen, if that's okay right now, just so I can see the people, if there are any images of people, hello. But if you need me to bring that back up, I can.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ariel. It's a wonderful new dimension to the work that's being developed around researching spirituality in the Jewish community. I think you're one of the very few who's really involved in this area, and so it's going to be great to hear more from you. And I think it would be helpful, if you wouldn't mind, just for a few minutes, just to tell us a little bit about the ethnographic research, and particularly kind of what were the sites that you were looking at. And I know you've given us some quotations here from people, but it'd be good just to hear a little bit about who were the people you were talking to that this new dimension of spirituality has emerged from.
Sure. So there were 3 sites in my study. They were all within the limits of the same city, but they all offered different approaches to the teaching and learning of Jewish spirituality. And I saw there was a question about teaching, and I hope I'll be able to get to that eventually too. So I looked at a Musar group, a mindfulness meditation group, and an urban agriculture group. They called what they did permaculture. So they're all Jewish groups. that advertise themselves as offering an opportunity to learn about Jewish spirituality. They're all groups for adults, so I didn't look at any work with kids or teens, and they all work with adults in their leisure time. So it's not, for example, like a program of rabbinic study or a master's degree. This is something that adults elect to do voluntarily, not for credit, in their free hours in the evenings or on weekends. In terms of age and generation, in the Musar group and the mindfulness meditation group, most participants were baby boomers, people in their 50s and 60s. And in the urban agriculture group, most participants were younger, millennials, 20s into the 30-somethings. And in both groups, all three groups, most participants were women. But there was a bit more gender balance in the urban agriculture group.
Great, that's really helpful. I'm sure people will want to pick up on what they know about those kind of sites and the people in them, and I'll come back to you on that. Can I ask you another question for clarification? And that's, can you just say a little bit about the difference between emotion and feelings? Because there might be some who say, look, feelings come and go. We change our feelings all the time. Is that enough of a standard by which to determine someone's identity, someone's disposition? Could you just say a bit about why emotion is a variable that's worth looking at and thinking about?
Sure. So first of all, a lot of people use these kinds of words interchangeably: emotion, feeling, affect, and some people use them a bit more precisely. So lots of times the way I sort of think about it is emotion and feeling, to me, are a bit interchangeable in that they're much more an in-the-moment kind of thing, which is why I like the idea of an emotional repertoire, which maybe is something akin to a sensibility in the sense that it's a long-term pattern that sort of is built up by the accretion of sort of the repetition of these emotions over time and in particular situations. Right, so in any particular moment, we have an emotional response, possibly, right? You might be having an emotional response to this webinar, hopefully not a highly negative one, but who knows, right? You have a sort of response, and that feeling might be fleeting, but it's part of a greater pattern, right, that I think is part of our culture, that we're sort of, and it doesn't come from nowhere, right? It's part of signals that you're getting, things that I'm saying, and as well as messages that you've been given over time that condition, right, and build up within you and sort of allow you access to a particular emotion. Now, some people will say that affect or feeling is like the actual physical sensation, and that emotion is sort of our own culturally defined definition of what that feeling is. So I'm sitting and my heart starts beating. I see something upsetting, let's say, and my heart starts beating really fast, and then my culture comes in and says, oh, you're feeling anxious, or oh, you're feeling angry. And so that's what emotion is versus feeling or affect. But there isn't really any there's no set definition about that. It's somewhat in flux, and different people working in the field use these words differently. I have like a chapter in the dissertation about sensation, feeling and sensation, and how people learn in Jewish spiritual settings to feel spiritual parts of their body. So how people learn to feel their soul, how people learn to feel their Yetzer Hara or their Yetzer HaTov, for example, which was part of the program of the Musar group. Yetzer HaTov is your good inclination, Yetzer Hara is your bad inclination. And people, particularly in the meditation group and the Musar group, were really gained a capacity to articulate where in their body they could physically feel those spiritual body locations. And so that I think about as feeling and sensation, and in terms of things like peace, tranquility, anxiety, I usually call those emotion.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that. So I suppose I want to ask about the connection between emotion and other aspects of Judaism's and the human personality's dispositions. We might categorize them as, the mind, the heart, and the hands. And Judaism, as we know, has been very much, as you've indicated, kind of an intellectual, a religion of intellect, a religion of the mind, but it's also been a religion of the hands, very much a doing religion. And one of the spiritual treatises of the Middle Ages talked about duties of the heart and duties of the limbs. So, and then we can, of course, include the mind in there. So can you just talk a little bit about this relationship in spirituality between heart, mind, and hands?
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for pointing out that the idea of Jewish spirituality is certainly not new, and you're referring to sort of one of the primary classical texts, Chovot HaLevavot. I just had a little beep. I hope I didn't lose you guys. I hope you can still hear me.
We're still here.
Okay, great. So right there has long been a sense of Jewish leaders proposing an intervention into Jewish life that calls the heart, the spiritual, the emotional out, and aims to offer some kind of corrective to a perception that Judaism has veered perhaps too far into the intellectual or into the rote action. And certainly there are also many people who talk about the spirituality of the law and the spirituality of those things that we might often be compelled to sort of put in opposition to spirituality. So there's a whole, this has been a long question, and there are many examples of Jewish leadership that's been exercised in terms of like a spiritual and emotional intervention. And it would certainly not be fair to say that Jewish spirituality is only about emotion. It is certainly also an intellectual pursuit and a physical practice. And that was also important in all of the sites that I observed. And so, when you do a research project, you can only sort of say, one thing sometimes, or paint a portrait of part of a culture that you get to observe and learn about. But certainly, text and study were often part of some of the programs. And they all involve some sort of physical practice. The mindfulness meditation group sat in mindful meditation together every week in the mornings for half an hour. That's what I observed. The agricultural group was incredibly focused on their food and the ingestion of food, which is a physical act, and how the food was absorbed into the self. That was quite important. They also did different activities around food production, could be cooking, could be gardening, canning, things of that nature. And the Musar group, which was of all of the groups the most engaged, I would say, in text study. They actually had a textbook that they used. They were interested in promoting acts of loving kindness. So they were very interested in trying to sort of use their spiritual education to act better in the world. So these are all features, but what I thought was quite interesting and striking was how emotion sort of was at the core of all of these sites that had their own activities and their own sort of their own texts, which were a bit different in all of the places, and sort of their own theories and sort of like intellectual work. They all had this emotional program at the heart of them, and there was a lot of alliance in the three sites about the sense of disjunction between where they wanted to bring the participants emotionally and what was probably their natural Jewish inheritance emotionally.
That's wonderful, and it demonstrates how a doctoral dissertation of such depth can allow us to highlight perhaps an aspect of the spiritual endeavor that we haven't yet thought about before, we haven't been able to put into the foreground. So it's really given us a new way of thinking about it, so appreciate that.
I mean, there's so much room. Go ahead, sorry. I mean, there's so few. I'm going to be quiet. Go ahead.
Okay. So I want to ask one last question, which will relate to the people on our webinar today. But before I do, I just want to get everybody ready so that after I've asked this question and you've answered it, I'm going to invite people to participate. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can either click that icon that has a little hand on it, which will flag up the fact that you want to ask a question, or just jump in, but remember to unmute yourself, and we'll get everybody involved. So Ariel, this is my last question for you. This is the hard one, okay? So everyone on this call, I think, by and large, is a Jewish educator of some sort. I certainly worked with some people there and have learned a lot from them, and hopefully we've been able to learn together. So I kind of want to ask the educational question, which is the kind of so what question. So now we know this. What does that say about educating for spirituality, or the enhancement of spirituality for our customers, our clients, ourselves, our children, our adults that we work with? What can we say educationally now about your work that will help us in our work?
Sure. So I think that, something that's important to highlight is, in some level, there are a lot of limitations in the sites that I looked at, in that they were for adults and that they were leisure activities. So there's this element of a voluntary element to everything that I saw. So this was very different, for example, from somebody who works with children who perhaps don't elect to be in a particular program, or for maybe somebody who works in rabbinic education and a course or a spiritual direction is a necessary part of their ordination or degree. So everybody I saw elected to be there of their own free will, and when they felt uncomfortable or didn't like what was going on, they had the capacity to leave the group. And indeed, there were a lot of people who dropped out along the way for various reasons. I was able to talk to some dropouts in some cases. And generally, they were people who were a little bit uncomfortable with what they would, talk about as like a touchy-feely element to the program. And I think that that's something as educators to take very seriously. What happens when we demand a kind of emotional intensity or emotional performance from our participants with varying degrees of their comfort with their own emotion and their desire to share their emotions publicly or in a semi-public space like a class. And so I think that that's something that I thought about quite seriously. What would it mean if we took some of these programs that participants generally found to be quite profound in terms of their impact on their Jewish identity and their, frankly, their entire identity and their the way that they go through the world. A lot of people really spoke about how they were deeply changed by these programs. But to what extent is that dependent on them being able to?
Ariel, we're getting some feedback, so hold on one second.
Okay, sure.
We're just going to mute some of the people who've come in.
Oh,
okay, try again.
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure.
Hold on, still getting feedback. Sound like a Martian. If everyone would mute their mics, that would be very helpful. Okay, try again.
Okay, I'm going to try again, and if this is not better, there's also the possibility of me calling on the phone if for whatever reason the mic setup is not working well, so you'll just let me know.
Let's go to a question actually now, and then while we're figuring out the technology, we'll see if we make sure that we can hear you when you speak. You're just being distorted a bit. So Matt's raised his hand, so let's start with Matt to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, maybe I'll turn my camera on. I'm curious about other types of positive emotions that could be experienced in spiritual settings that you didn't discuss, things that are kind of more extreme states like bliss, or kind of the types of emotions that people might cultivate in a neo-Hasidic environment and things like that. And I just have a curiosity about what your thoughts are on things like that, and if those types of experiences could fit into your study.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm so eager to answer. Okay, so Matt identifies something really interesting, and that is a line that the participants make between the emotional repertoire for spirituality, which is the work they see themselves doing, and emotional repertoires for other forms that were often sort of associated with Jewish renewal or perhaps Neo-Hasidism that Matt offers as an example. And really, I'm just trying to think if there are any exceptions. There might be some exceptions in the urban agricultural group, but certainly within the Musar group and the mindfulness meditation group, there was this sense of there were emotions that were too extreme that took place in other settings, and those were outside the bounds of Jewish spirituality. And that part of the work, in fact, was not to get overwhelmed or have too extreme sort of an emotional tenor. Was important in those settings. There was this idea, right, that spirituality could be dangerous. That's like a thread that people maybe have heard about, right? There's the famous story of the four who entered, right, the Pardes, and only Rabbi Akiva survives. And this idea that one always needed a guide. It was important that one learn Jewish spirituality from a teacher as opposed to kind of just embark on it as a path by themselves, because it was very powerful and potentially dangerous, and a person could be led astray. And that spirituality was about positive emotion, but mild positive emotion. You don't ever have ecstasy in these settings. For example, the leader of the Musar movement would probably have called that grooving on God. He used that term sometimes, which he thought was a bad idea. That was people's sort of ego and personal experience getting sort of blown out of proportion. And the idea was to produce this kind of mild positive affect that would let you act in the world in a positive way, but not to get sort of so deep into positive emotion that you might lose sight of the real world. So, for example, I had one woman in the study where she had gone to Eilat Chaim, and she saw that as outside the bounds. Okay, I remember she said something like, people were speaking in tongues, it was so weird. That was not part of spirituality as the people in my study understood it. That was too crunchy granola. It was too out there. And people were somewhat suspicious of it, and some of the teachers even taught against that kind of emotional, spiritual expression. So Chava Weissler, Chava Weissler has done a lot of work in the renewal movement, and so I sort of always saw like a line between the kinds of places I was looking at and the kinds of places Chava was looking at. I think she has much more ecstatic expression of emotion, where I have a much more sort of tempered emotional repertoire in the sites that I saw. That's a great question. Thanks, Matt.
Other questions, comments, thoughts? Feel free to unmute and come in and ask. While we're waiting on that, perhaps I'll just ask the kind of the corollary of Matt's question, which is kind of on the negative emotions. I see here on your diagram on the first PowerPoint, you go all the way perhaps to, well, it's not a spectrum of positive to negative, but there are what we might think of as negative emotions in there. Did you find that there were people who perhaps did feel despair or anxiety or concern and saw that as a spiritual disposition, as a spiritual quality, when they were coming to know their true selves in a way that had a heightened emotion, but it wasn't necessarily the contemplation or the bliss, but it was rather the negative one? Was that a part of the experience of people as well?
I didn't ever, there are certainly, strands in Jewish tradition where we might think that, sorrow or righteous anger, brokenheartedness, that those could all be emotions that we associate with spirituality, but that's not something that I saw in these sites. They were, again, really devoted, it seemed, to that kind of mild, positive affect. And sometimes there was often sort of like a pattern you might see in some of the settings. For example, the urban agriculture group, that there was often sort of a way the program was organized emotionally, where there would be like some introductory lecture that was really quite disheartening about sort of the state of the world and the environment, and things are really bad, and there was a kind of like sad, deflated feeling in the room. But then the participants were sort of always offered this tool that was supposed to make things better. So by canning or growing kale in their backyard, or frequenting the farmer's market, right? There was sort of some way that they could overcome that negative and sort of hopeless feeling. So the hopelessness was never really seen as the goal emotionally of the program, but I definitely noticed that there was a pattern there of this kind of movement from eliciting a bit of negative emotion and then sort of coming in with the positive emotion after. In the Musar group, it was sort of very common. People would reflect on their behavior over the course of the last week to the VAD or the committee of their peers, and the pattern was often, I fell short of my goals, I'm a bad person, I didn't do a really good job, and they would sort of do a performance of feeling really bad about themselves, and then the group would come in and be like, oh no, but really, you're great, and some people would cry, and some people would hug. I mean, I'm sounding a little bit flippant about it, but that was because it was really like a pattern that played out of negative emotion being induced initially, and then ultimately, though, the participants were supposed to leave with that positive emotion, and the sort of the work over the course of the program was moving from feeling bad to feeling good.
Great, thank you. Anyone want to reflect on their own experience of working in this area and the emotions that are developed by people as they do so? Happy to hear from you. Questions or comments? I see Jackie Sarabani-Kessner is on the line, and Jackie works with us on spiritual exploration using the arts. I wonder, Jackie, if you have any comments on working with your clients and its relationship to the emotional repertoire.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, this has been a really interesting webinar. Thank you so much for the thinking and for the research. The work that I do is brought through a creative lens, but I've been thinking a lot about the class I'm about to enter into in less than 3 minutes. And it's called although typically, as Michael said, I teach through the expressive and arts using music, sound, drama, the visual arts in all of its forms. I also teach the joy of Jewish cooking, and tonight, it's not about cooking. I mean, I'm not a chef, although I love food. It's about what you infuse into the experience. So it's about what are you putting into the kreplach besides the raw, beautiful ingredients from the earth. What are you putting of yourself into this kreplach that you're feeding and other people, a part of your soul or about a part of your spirit that gets engaged with the process of creating and figuring out what it is you need and what it is you hope to bring to others. And that spiritual experience through learning, using cooking in this case as a medium, is something that for me is a way of helping children and young adults that I teach this to connect spiritually through the work of what we're doing here, making sense of the blessings when we're cutting parsley and we smell it and we have that aromatic connection and experience. It brings the blessing to light, and it brings our connection to the meaning of how it grows and its freshness and all of the senses that come with it. And so that's, I mean, this is all very inspiring work. I'm eager to learn more from you. And the same thing when you see a child mix colors together and create discovery and new colors, so that they bring that into their thinking, so that if they're going on a journey, lech lecha, and they're going forth, what do they see? What do they smell? What do they taste? What do they hear? How do they listen? All of these experiences, not everyone is verbal or oral, and they want to have that experience of getting in through another medium. I think that's an enriching piece of the spiritual learning and development and sort of the soul experience.
Great.
I actually really do need to go leave to set up my class, but
thank you
all so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for being with us. Let me turn to Marcy Goldberg, who's joining us from California. Marcy is an experienced Musar teacher, a trained spiritual director, and works with adults and with children. Marcy, do you have any reactions to working with adults and thinking about their emotions when they're doing this work?
Marcy, we'll need you, if you can chime in, we need you to unmute, but I know you were having some problems with audio earlier.
There we go.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Does that work? Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, for me, it goes back to that whole idea of, you know, how do we use this? I mean, I've got a religious school of 400 children, and Musar is a very active component of what we do. Each month we look at a different midah in our classrooms and throughout the entire temple. And so how do we do that? And it goes back to what Ariel was saying about, you know, how do we do this when we're kind of demanding an emotional response, but yet, you know, there are children all over the place. Some will go with the flow, and others will really refrain from wanting to react and wanting to go into that emotional place. So what we found is that using the different midot has been wonderful, but some really grab it and some really gravitate to it, and others don't want to go there with it. I mean, the whole idea of spirituality and bringing that into the classroom, it should have always been there. You know, how can we have Jewish education? How can we talk about God? How, you know, and how can we not have that? And yet, for so many years, we didn't. So,
I think, Marcy, you're highlighting like a really interesting question. And I mean, the way that I've come to think about it is that kind of the voluntary participation is an immensely important feature, I think. That being said, I think that everybody should have the opportunity to be exposed to this kind of teaching. So, like, for example, if I think of, say, like a middle school or high school program, right, just like you want to expose maybe all kids to, you know, rabbinic literature or Jewish philosophy, you also, I think, want to offer all kids exposure to Jewish spirituality so they sort of understand all the different opportunities and ways of connecting there are to Jewish culture and the Jewish people and Jewish tradition, and that some kids are going to gravitate to that kind of spiritual practice and spiritual connection to Judaism, and some kids are going to just be like, wow, I'm really down with this Gemara thing, or, I mean, you know, and that just, we don't want to sort of dictate, just like I think traditionally in Jewish education we've put a lot of emphasis on, you know, tech skill or language skill or, you know, being like a bright, quick thinker, things like that. And I think that was to the detriment of some students and some learners. I think we don't want to then have the pendulum swing so far that, you know, there are kids who are more private about their emotional life, and that doesn't mean that they don't have an emotional life. And I think there can also often be discomfort for people when they don't feel like they're in sync emotionally with the room. So if everybody in the room is like having a moment of like love, you know, for somebody, and they're all sort of crying and like deeply engaged in the program, and then one person is like more emotionally reticent or sort of not feeling things, that can be an isolating experience, maybe much the way it could feel isolating if you don't enjoy traditional text study, or your Hebrew skills are not, we don't want it to become an opportunity to isolate students or make them feel like they're not part of. So it's one opportunity to connect, but it probably shouldn't be the only opportunity in a non-voluntary kind of setting like a Hebrew school or a day school.
So let me follow up that with Marcy's point that some may be interested naturally and some may not. Do you think it's our role as educators to manipulate people's emotions in order to get them to this, what did you call it, mild positive state? And I suppose I've just put that kind of negatively, but let me tell you a positive way in which I think that does work. As you know, many people know, I've been involved with a project called Torah Godly Play, and one of the aspects of that is to prepare people for the experience by introducing them to the sacred space that we create in a particular way that calms them down, slows them down, and provides an opportunity to provide kind of an approach to spiritual work that begins in such a way that really, I suppose, does change their emotional state from perhaps being high energy to somewhat more what you might call mild positive. So I wonder whether that's a role for us as Jewish educators to think about how to do that, of course in an appropriate way, but is that something that Jewish education should take into account?
I mean, you use the word manipulation, which is obviously sort of like a very negatively, negative valence word when we think about the educational process, right? And I would just say that any educational setting, and not just spiritual educational settings, are presenting learners with a preferred emotional script. So in academia, right, we're presenting, which is sort of the world that I inhabit a lot of the time, the preferred emotional script is one in which one does not reveal emotion, right? So there's no such thing as, I think, an educational setting that is not offering some vision of how a person should model themselves emotionally. So I'm not sure that people engaged in what they understand as spiritual education should see what they're doing as sort of any worse or more manipulative, for example, than another setting. Sort of we're all engaged in modeling a kind of emotional behavior for our learners. And I think part of learning to be a member of a religious community is learning to inhabit the preferred emotional repertoire of that community. So somebody who comes from like an ecstatic Pentecostal kind of church is going to find themselves kind of out of place in your like run-of-the-mill conservative synagogue in New York if they're, shouting hallelujah from the pews where everybody else is kind of like sitting quietly and maybe chit-chatting with their neighbor, right? You want to try and bring people into the kind of emotional repertoire that's going to allow them to successfully participate in their religious community, and that's part of the job of an educator. I think we just we want to be sensitive about that, and I'm not just an academic, I'm also a mom, and like when I relate to my kids, especially when they were little, I always used to say to them, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. And I think that that's true in religious and spiritual education as well. It's important that we give that message to people that if what you're feeling is out of sync with your perception of the group, like that's okay. There's still a place for you, and we can find a place for you. So if you're not feeling in sync with the group, if you're not feeling that mild positive affect that we're trying to model and say can be a positive part of our religious community, there's a place for you in Judaism and Jewish tradition, and I think that's important that we show that to our learners.
Right. I think we've come almost to the end of our time together, but we just wanted to add one little piece to this, and while we're setting it up, I just want to thank you, Ariel, very much for sharing your ongoing research with us, and this has really been, as I said, kind of a foregrounding of an area we haven't really paid attention to either in Jewish education or in the field of spirituality. So it's really a wonderful appreciation of your time and energy that you've been able to share it with us today. We look forward to more of it. And if people are interested in more, then we are just going to show you one slide which indicates how you can get more from us, and it's coming up right in 1 second. And I certainly want to appreciate everyone who's joined us on the webinar today. Has that come up?
Yeah.
If you're looking at your screen, you're getting a bit of a mix of things here. We'll just see if we can get it up. But basically, it's a slide that shows our PhD program, which is an online program for people all over the country with a summer residency requirement. And it's in conjunction with a local teacher preparation university, Lesley University. And we're going to do a webinar just for learning about the PhD in Jewish Educational Leadership on noon on Thursday, February the 4th. So if you're interested in that, we'll send out a reminder email that will be available for anyone who's interested in admissions to our PhD program. I'm going to turn it over, Deb, to just conclude and finalize our time together.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks, Ariel, for preparing such a compelling view into American Jewish spirituality and what's going on in a deep way. I'm actually getting off of this call, and I'm signing up for a 40-day yoga intensive. So not in a Jewish context, but whenever I'm in that space, I'm always thinking about where it does conflict with my Jewish life, where it doesn't. So this was both inspirational and also helped me, and I'm sure others, think about both their personal spirituality and also how it manifests in their professional lives. So thank you for giving us all of those views. We will stay on for a couple of minutes just in case there are any logistical questions about PhD or for Ariel. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.